next, we're going to take a look at how a nuclear fission reaction. Now, the word fission means to split. So in a nuclear fission reactor, they get their power from the splitting of atoms, most commonly from uranium-235, which is a rare isotope of uranium. So a nuclear reactor is a device that permits a very sustained, controlled nuclear fission chain reaction. And the main danger with nuclear power is if that nuclear chain reaction starts happening too fast. If it gets going too fast, you can have a runaway nuclear chain reaction, and it will generate so much heat that it will melt the fuel, and the molten fuel will burn its way right through the containment building. It'll go down into the ground. And it'll keep going down to the ground because uranium is very heavy. It'll keep going down because it gets very, very hot. And if it hits an aquifer or groundwater, the fear is that could create a steam explosion which would blow up the whole containment building, and it would spew highly radioactive material over a large area. And that almost happened one time here in the United States at a nuclear power plant, I think it was in Pennsylvania, called the 3 Mile Island plant. They did have a partial meltdown of the nuclear power plant. The fuel rods melted down, but it wasn't able to go all the way down and cause a steam explosion. So when the nucleus of a uranium-235 atom is struck by a slowly moving neutron from another atom, the nucleus splits into smaller particles, and it releases a large amount of energy, lots of heat. And if those neutrons hit other atoms of uranium-235, it causes more atoms to break down, and that causes a chain reaction which produces an enormous amount of energy. And so in order to control that nuclear chain reaction, you need several things to keep it from heating up too much. If it heats up too much, it will melt down, and then you've got a problem. So the first thing you need is a moderator. A moderator is a substance that absorbs neutrons, which slows down the chain reaction so it doesn't heat up too much. And so the two most common materials that are used as moderators are water, which is that's what most nuclear power plants in the United States use as a moderator, is water, or graphite. The Chernobyl plant in present-day Ukraine, when it literally blew up and caught on fire, it used graphite as a moderator, and that may have contributed to the accident, the fact that it did use water. The other thing that a nuclear power plant has to happen are control rods. Control rods are rods that are made out of a material that cannot break down like radioactive elements, and it's lowered down in the reactor between the fuel rods. Rods are usually found in the form of rods of uranium-235, or sometimes they're pellets of fuel. These control rods are lowered down in between the fuel rods, and they absorb neutrons. And so people operating the plants, or the computers that are operating power plants, can control the rate of the fission chain reaction by either lowering the control rods further down in between the fuel rods, or by withdrawing it slightly. The more you withdraw it, the faster the chain reaction occurs and the hotter it gets. And so they can control the rate of the breakdown of the uranium-235. And then the third thing you need is a coolant. You need a coolant to moderate so that that heat can be used to generate electricity. The coolant is usually either liquid metals or gases in some reactors. Coolant is usually water, but it can be a liquid metal or a gas in some reactors. So this is a diagram showing a typical pressurized water reactor, fission nuclear reactor. And so the concentrated uranium-235 that's used as a fuel, that is contained within a closed building that has very thick walls of concrete. That's to prevent any of the radiation from escaping into the environment from the fuel. So the fuel rods are within this containment building. So these red rods that you see here, those are the fuel rods that contain uranium-235 that can spontaneously decay and start a chain reaction. These are the control rods up here. So the control rods can be moved down in between the fuel rods. That will absorb the neutrons, which will slow down the chain reaction. Or if it's not generating enough heat, the control rods can be withdrawn, and then that will allow the chain reaction to increase, which will cause an increase in temperature. You don't want that process to get run away though, because then you have what's called a meltdown. Now, I'm kind of familiar a little bit. I developed a little bit of familiarity with nuclear power plants because when I was working on my master's degree in Idaho, my project involved field biology, and I actually did my research on the Idaho National Engineering Laboratory, which is a 900 square mile area where they test experimental nuclear power plants. They also have a training facility for people that work on nuclear subs. And I did my research out in this area. It's kind of high desert, sagebrush grassland area. And at one time or another, they had, I don't remember how many nuclear power plants they had there, but they had a large number. They had like over 30 nuclear power plants on this one area of Idaho. And they ran tests on them. They experimented. They experimented with different kinds of coolants. They experimented with different kinds of control rods. They actually even did experiments where they withdrew the control rods to see what would happen if they just allowed the reaction to run away. They hopefully stopped it before it melted down. But anyway, while I was working out there, I heard that very early on in the history of nuclear power, there are two test reactors. One of them is now a museum. They have a visitor center there where you can go and look at it. I think it's called EBR-1. There was another experimental plant, and apparently there were only two guys that were running the plant. And supposedly, at least this is the story that the government says, one of those two people decided to commit suicide. So the way he did it is he withdrew the control rods from the nuclear power plant, and the chain reaction increased, and he allowed that to continue, and it got so hot that it caused actually there was water was a coolant. It got so hot it caused a steam explosion. The containment building exploded, and it killed the guy who did that, as well as one other worker that was working there. And it caused so much radioactive contamination of the area that they buried the whole, it was a smaller plant, mind you, not like a big commercial plant, it was a smaller plant, it was an experimental plant. They buried the whole containment building along with the bodies of the two men right on the spot, right on that site. And to this day, that area, now it's completely buried underground now, but if you go out to the area, which you wouldn't be allowed to do, because the ground above that is so radioactive you wouldn't want to spend very much time there. And I actually worked with another graduate student who was doing a research project on that area. He was studying small mammals that were burrowing into that ground where that experimental reactor was buried, because they were concerned these animals like gophers were burrowing down and getting contaminated with radioactive elements and then carrying that out when they left their burrows and spreading that out in other areas. So anyway, this heats up as a result of the chain reaction, which can be controlled using the control rods. And that's surrounded by, well, the fuel rods are surrounded by water that's circulated by a pump. And so the chain reaction heats up that water, it superheats the water because the water is under pressure, and so it can't expand to form a gas, so it gets superheated. That water is then pumped into a steam generator. So hot water goes through a container that has water under lower pressure, that converts that water into steam. The steam then goes through a steam turbine which turns, and the turning of an electrical coil then generates electricity. That steam then goes through a cooling tower, usually, where cold water is run through it. That cools down the steam to liquid water again, which goes back into the steam generator. So there's several problems that can occur with this. If the fuel rods heat up too much, they can melt down, and they'll melt through the bottom of the containment structure. Another problem is if these pipes that are circulating the superheated water, if you have a leak from one of those pipes, then your coolant from the reactor will leak out, and again that will heat up too much, and it could possibly cause a meltdown. So that's basically how it works. The radioactive chain reaction, nuclear chain reaction, generates heat. The heat is used to heat up either water or a molten metal. That runs through a steam generator, which generates steam. The steam is used to turn a turbine, which generates electricity. So it basically works the same way like as a coal-fired or oil-fired plant. The only difference is instead of burning coal or burning oil to generate the heat, you're using nuclear fission to generate the heat. Okay. One of the reasons that radioactive elements are so dangerous to living organisms is that they spontaneously produce what's called ionizing radiation. Ionizing radiation it's called ionizing radiation because when a living organism is exposed to those radioactive particles, that alpha, beta, or gamma radiation, it causes damage to the molecules of the body of living organisms. It can cause damage to DNA. And if the DNA is damaged, that can cause mutations, which can lead to things like cancer. If a person, however, is exposed to very, very high levels of radiation, if you get exposed to too much radiation, it will actually destroy your bone marrow. And your bone marrow is what produces your blood cells. And that was one of the problems that happened in the Chernobyl accident in the former Soviet Union. A lot of the workers, there was like close to, 50 or 100 workers got exposed to such high level radiation that it destroyed their bone marrow. If your bone marrow dies, then you don't have very many weeks to live. You only have about 2 weeks to live. Because the red blood cells, which carry the oxygen in your body, they only live for about 2 weeks. So your body has to be constantly producing new red blood cells from your red bone marrow. If your red bone marrow dies off, you run out of red blood cells and you die. And the only treatment for that is to do a bone marrow transplant, which we had the technology to do that back then when the Chernobyl plant exploded. But the Russians didn't have the medical technology to do bone marrow transplants, and so a lot of their workers died. But the United States did send some surgeons over to Russia to do some bone marrow transplants, which probably saved the lives of those people they were able to do it on. So the other problem, even if a person doesn't die from the radiation, it can create mutations which can eventually lead to cancer, sometimes decades later. So even if a person got a bone marrow transplant, there's still the chance that they could end up dying from cancer at some later point in time. So there's been 3 major nuclear power plants, one in 3 Mile Island in 1979, one in Chernobyl in the present-day Ukraine in 1986. At that time, it was still part of the Soviet Union. This is a picture here, I believe, of the 3 Mile Island. It's kind of an island in a river. And then more recently, in 2011, due to a tidal wave, there was an accident at the Fukushima power plant in Japan. And the plant actually caught on fire. It did release quite a bit of radiation, much of which ended up going into the ocean, which caused some marine organisms like fish to take up some of those radioactive elements, which made them so that you couldn't eat them anymore. Otherwise, you would end up ingesting radioactive elements. 3 Mile Island meltdown, that was a partial reactor meltdown caused by equipment failure, also human error. People that were running the plant, actually, so the instruments were telling them there was something wrong, but they didn't believe it. They thought the instruments were malfunctioning, so they didn't do anything. They didn't lower the control rods into the fuel rods to slow down the reaction. And so it did result in a partial meltdown, but it didn't result in much release of radiation into the environment. There was some, but there were no direct deaths. But that led to a lot of improvements in nuclear safety. It also caused the American public to doubt the safety of nuclear power plants. So that kind of began the end of the use of a lot of nuclear power. Chernobyl, the reactor actually exploded during a safety test. There was a massive radiation release, and there was immediate and long-term health impacts, and there was widespread contamination across Europe. This is a picture of where it exploded. Fukushima, that accident was caused by an earthquake and tsunami. There were multiple reactor meltdowns and radiation leaks, and there was large-scale evacuations and contaminations. So, nuclear power plants do have a limited lifespan. The radiation actually causes the concrete and stuff to break down. So eventually they have to stop using that, and when they do, they have to decommission it. Most of them have a lifespan of 30 to 40 years. So they don't demolish it because that could release contamination. So usually what they do is they remove the fuel and then they store it on site, since we don't have a permanent storage place yet. And then they just usually leave the plant standing there. And in some cases they turn it into a visitor center so people can learn about nuclear power. So in summary, nuclear fission is the splitting of the nucleus of an atom. All reactors contain a core with fuel, a moderator to control the rate of the reaction, and a cooling mechanism to prevent the reactor from overheating. Fuel and waste must be transported and stored. Each step in the use of nuclear power presents a danger of exposure. So at that Idaho National Engineering Laboratory, where I worked, there was actually a low-level nuclear waste site just about a mile or two from where I was working. It actually found radiactive contamination just out in the sagebrush. And I scooped up a little bit of it, took it in the lab. As I had a Geiger counter, I could check for that. And I said, where did this come from? He said, oh, it probably just fell off a truck. Because the road that I was on went right into the low-level radioactive waste site. It's like where they dispose medical waste, radioactive medical waste. And he said, yeah, it probably just fell off a truck, which wasn't too comforting. So anyway, that's a little bit about nuclear power. So don't forget, we have a test on Monday. Make sure to be in and we will meet back down in 108 again.